My brother made my life hell, then got my wife pregnant. Now, he's begging for help after our parents disowned him and left me their $2 million inheritance. David, my younger brother, always had a deep resentment towards me. Surprisingly, it wasn't jealousy. He was the favored one, not me. Our mother always indulged David. He was the golden child. She cooked his meals, did his laundry, and even asked me to help him with schoolwork. I was expected to assist him simply because we were family, but I never got the same consideration. I accepted it because I was independent. Maybe it was my fault for always helping him without expecting anything in return. He never helped me and only approached when he needed something. I was introverted, preferring to study and keep to myself. He was loud and rough, just like Dad. I tend to be straightforward and honest, and I think my mother resented me for it. Her favoritism made David the family darling, but I didn't mind until he started bullying me. David teased me about my height and glasses, and he even snuck into my room, read my diary, and tattled to Mom. When I yelled at him, our parents laughed, saying it wasn't a big deal. But it was. He nearly broke my glasses and once put stones in my cereal. Luckily, I found them before breaking my teeth. Mom dismissed it, saying, "This is how brothers bond." During fights, David always went after my insecurities. Instead of supporting me when bullies at school tormented me, he joined in, calling me names like loser and hairy monkey. One time, during a trivial argument, he told me to kill myself. That cut deep. I was already struggling with my mental health then, and hearing it from my brother was devastating. With Dad at work and Mom indifferent, things got worse. David tried to set my hair on fire in high school, and Mom defended him, saying he was just playing. Thankfully, Dad stepped in, warning David that he'd call the police if it ever happened again. It was a wake-up call for David. He'd never faced consequences before. My dad, who usually sided with David, finally realized that David was becoming a bully. I nearly cried when Dad admitted this. I told him everything about the years of bullying, even the stuff at school. The next day, Dad spoke to the school principal and then signed me up for MMA classes, telling me to stand up for myself. As a nerdy kid, it seemed laughable, but I was determined. MMA changed my life. I stayed focused, balancing studies and workouts, and grew stronger. One day, David stole my pocket money. I caught him as he was about to leave with his friends. I demanded it back, and he mocked me, saying I'd run to Dad. Something snapped. I punched him in the face. He fell, stunned, and I took my money back. David cried, and Mom scolded me, saying I should be a better role model. She complained to Dad, but Dad asked us both to explain. I told him how David had stolen my money, and Dad backed me up, saying David was lucky I didn't call the police. David threw a tantrum, screamed that he hated me, and locked himself in his room. After that, he distanced himself. He knew he couldn't bully me anymore. While he couldn't physically hurt me, he resorted to verbal insults when our parents weren't around. Over the years, David grew angrier, and it became clear he harbored a deeper resentment. He refused to speak to me directly, even when he needed something, using Mom as a messenger instead. When I asked her why David wouldn't talk to me, she always told me to be more understanding. By that point, I just wanted to escape and get away from him for good. I repeatedly asked my mother to mediate a sit-down conversation between David and me to resolve our issues, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. When I asked her why David treated me this way, she brushed off the question, leaving me with no answers and growing frustration. Eventually, I left for my dream university, having earned a scholarship as a top student. My dad threw a party for me, and even my mother seemed proud for once. But David stayed aloof, barely acknowledging my achievement. The day I left for university was a bittersweet moment, excited for the future, but mostly relieved to escape the toxic environment of my childhood. The first few months at university felt like a breath of fresh air. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and slowly built a life away from the oppressive atmosphere back home. The constant anxiety from David's verbal attacks had finally lifted, giving me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I started to feel like my own person for the first time. During my second year, I met Karen at a frat party. She was introduced to me by a mutual friend, and from the moment we started talking, we clicked. We shared common interests, and I was drawn to her warmth and sense of humor. Coming from a religious background, I'd always envisioned a traditional life where marriage and family were sacred. Karen seemed to share those values. We started dating, and soon enough, she became my best friend and confidant. When we discovered that she was pregnant in our final year, it was a shock. Having children out of wedlock was frowned upon in both our families. We decided to marry right after graduation to give our child a stable home. Our wedding was a small but joyful affair. My parents were genuinely happy for us, and even David showed up, although he remained distant, as always. For a brief moment, I felt like my life was finally falling into place. I had a beautiful wife, a child on the way, and I was about to start my career. I thought I was living my dream. I always imagined myself as a one-woman man. Despite attention from other women over the years, I had never been tempted. Karen was my dream girl, and I had no reason to look elsewhere. But life doesn't always go according to plan. A few years into our marriage, I discovered Karen had been unfaithful twice. The first affair was with a married co-worker, an intermittent relationship that had spanned several years. The second was a brief fling with her ex-boyfriend during a visit to her family. Some might say I was naive, and looking back, I can't disagree. After each revelation, we separated for a while, but in the end, I chose to forgive her. I didn't want to raise our child in a broken home, and I believed we could overcome these obstacles. I chalked up her affair with the co-worker to youthful mistakes and poor judgment, hoping it was something we could move past. For a while, things seemed to improve, but deep down, I knew I could never fully trust her again. Despite the lingering doubts, I tried my best to set them aside. I had made the decision to forgive, and I wanted to work toward a fresh start. It had been 4 years since her second betrayal, and I felt secure in my choice to give her another chance. Karen seemed to have changed. We were happy again, at least. I thought so. We even began planning for a bigger family, talking about the future with optimism. But 3 months ago, my world came crashing down once more. Karen revealed to me that she had been having another affair. This time, the affair was long-term, and she dropped another bombshell. Our son, the boy I had raised and loved with all my heart, might not be mine. Her confession left me reeling. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could the woman I loved and trusted betray me like this? In a daze, I asked her how long this had been going on and why she had kept this secret from me for so long. Her responses were cold and detached, as though she didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. She showed no remorse, offering vague answers that only deepened the wound. My mind raced with questions, but I struggled to focus on any one thought. I couldn't believe this was happening. Finally, after pressing her for more information, Karen dropped the ultimate bombshell. The man she had been sleeping with, the father of my son, was my own brother, David. At that moment, my entire world collapsed. I stared at her, unable to process what she had just said. Karen explained that it all started during the holidays when I had introduced her to my family. She stayed with us from Thanksgiving until New Year's. During that time, David, who had always been cold toward me, was surprisingly warm and polite toward her. I remember feeling relieved that my brother wasn't his usual hostile self, happy that Karen didn't feel unwelcome in my family. Karen told me that she noticed the tension between David and me and had asked me about it. I had opened up to her about our strained relationship, explaining that I doubted we'd ever reconcile. She seemed to understand, but she began including David in more of our activities, hoping to help us bond. Whenever we watched a movie, she invited David along. At first, it seemed to work. David and I exchanged a few words, which was more than we had done in years. Looking back, I now remember how Karen and David often played video games together. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it all made sense. She told me that David had been going through a rough breakup, and he had confided in her. Their relationship grew closer, and before long, it escalated into something more. Karen admitted that David would flirt with her when I wasn't around, and eventually, things spiraled out of control. The thought of my wife and brother together made me physically ill. Karen confessed that she felt guilty afterward and left him, which explained why she abruptly decided to go home instead of staying with me for New Year's. She claimed that was the last time they had been together until recently, when they reignited the affair. Karen admitted that she never knew if our son was mine or David's, but she chose to stay with me because I was the more dependable brother. Hearing that broke me. She said the reason we got married was because she thought I'd make a better father. The betrayal was unbearable. I asked Karen if she had been seeing David recently, and she slowly nodded. She revealed that they had continued the affair, sneaking off to hotels, lying to me about working late or going on business trips. Half of her so-called work trips were actually romantic getaways with my own brother. I asked her why she married me if she wanted David. She tearfully admitted that she didn't want to be the one to break off the marriage. She saw me as a great father to our son and thought she could make it work. But in her words, she made a mistake and didn't know when to stop. Numb with shock, I told Karen I appreciated her honesty, but that I needed to leave. As I packed my clothes, she broke down in tears, begging for forgiveness. But I stayed calm. I had nothing left to say. Karen insisted that if I truly loved her, I should fight for our marriage. She claimed that everyone makes mistakes, even in the best relationships. When she realized I wasn't going to do anything, her tone changed. She started arguing that a divorce would harm our son and that children should never grow up in broken homes. I reminded her, as coldly as I could, that our son might not even be mine. That struck a nerve, and she broke down in tears, accusing me of cruelty. It was clear that Karen believed nothing I could do would make me leave her. She was likely right. To a degree, I had let things slide in the past and perhaps given her reason to think I would again. While I did love her once, it was now more of a lingering feeling tied to the fact that we had been together since college, and I thought we were raising a child together. Karen continued to insist that it wasn't too late to fix things, that we could rebuild the trust. But I struggled to believe her, and I had no patience left for her pleas. Her words felt hollow. The reality was, even if I somehow managed to forgive her, I knew I could never forget what she had done, especially that she had slept with my brother. Trust, for me, was a cornerstone of any relationship, and without it, love had no foundation. I had always been someone who believed in forgiveness, understanding that no one is perfect, but what Karen had done was unforgivable. This wasn't a mere mistake, it was a repeated, deliberate betrayal. I left her crying on the doorstep as I checked into a hotel that night. The following morning, I headed to my parents' house, where I laid everything bare. I explained Karen's affair with David and how they had been secretly sleeping together for years behind my back. The shock on my parents' faces was immediate and undeniable. My mother, however, true to her nature, initially tried to defend David, claiming that her beloved son could never do something so heinous. Determined to expose the truth, I asked my parents to let me handle it. I told them to stay quiet while I called David and confronted him over the phone, making him think it was just between us. When David answered, I calmly confronted him about the affair. He vehemently denied it at first, refusing to accept any responsibility. But when I told him that Karen had admitted everything, he changed tactics. He started calling her names, accusing her of being a woman of poor character, as if trying to shift all the blame onto her. David said it wasn't his fault if women were naturally attracted to him, and that, as the better-looking brother, this sort of thing was inevitable. His arrogance left me speechless for a moment. The level of disrespect he showed toward me and Karen was staggering. I told him I planned to expose him to the family, to which David laughed and said no one would believe me. He arrogantly called himself the golden child, convinced he could charm his way out of any situation. What he didn't realize was that our parents had heard everything. As the conversation continued, my father, who had been silent until that point, took the phone from me. In his usually reserved but firm tone, my father addressed David directly. "David," my father began, his voice heavy with disappointment. "What you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother. It's a betrayal of this family. You slept with your brother's wife and carried on this affair even after they were married. This is beyond forgivable. I raised you both to value family, loyalty, and decency. You have shattered all of that." My father's words seemed to weigh on David like a hammer. He had never seen my father this angry. Dad continued, "You've shown a complete disregard for your brother's feelings, for the sanctity of his marriage, and for our family. Your behavior is unacceptable. As a result, I'm cutting you off. No more financial support. You're on your own now. You'll need to figure out how to pay your college fees and take care of yourself without my money." Hearing my father say those words felt like justice. David had always been the favorite, the one who could do no wrong. But now, the truth was out, and it was clear that even my father wouldn't tolerate his actions any longer. David tried to justify his behavior, stammering out weak excuses, but my father wouldn't hear any of it. He firmly ended the call, shutting down any further attempts David made to explain away his betrayal. My mother, still in disbelief, embraced me. It was the first time in years that I felt truly supported by her. In that hug, there was an unspoken apology for the years of her taking David's side. She finally saw the truth. Afterward, my dad helped me find a good lawyer to begin divorce proceedings against Karen. It was a messy process. Karen and her lawyer tried to play dirty, demanding alimony because I earned more than her, but her affair with David weighed heavily in my favor. We also conducted a paternity test, and it was confirmed. David was indeed the biological father of the child I had loved and raised for years. That revelation cut deeper than anything else. Even more painful than Karen's infidelity was the realization that the son I had devoted myself to was not mine. I was furious, heartbroken. Karen begged me to continue visiting him, arguing that the boy shouldn't be punished for the sins of his parents. But I couldn't bear to see him. He was a constant reminder of David, and I hated it. I told Karen I needed space, that I couldn't be a part of their lives anymore. It felt harsh, but it was the only way I knew how to protect myself from further pain. After my divorce was finalized, I moved into a small bachelor apartment. Living alone felt surreal. I had married young, never having the chance to experience true independence. But I quickly adapted to my new lifestyle. I focused on my career and hobbies, rediscovering the parts of myself I had lost over the years. The space and freedom helped me start the healing process. 2 weeks ago, my dad called me with news that shook me once more. He was planning to change his will, cutting David out entirely. He didn't want to leave anything to him. David had always been the golden child, and now my father was ready to leave him with nothing. The assets, the house, everything would go to me. My dad had worked hard all his life, and his estate, retirement fund, and life insurance totaled close to $2 million. He was making it clear that David wouldn't get a cent, except for the symbolic $1 he would leave in the will just so David couldn't contest it. Somehow, David found out about this. Unable to reach our parents, he called me in a panic, begging for a second chance. He explained that his life had fallen apart. Karen was pressuring him for child support, and he was struggling to pay his bills. He had dropped out of college because he couldn't afford it and had taken a part-time job as a mechanic. Desperate, he asked me to talk to our parents to help him fix things. I laughed in his face. I told him that he had made his bed and now had to lie in it. If he was struggling, that was his problem. I reminded him that he should have thought about the consequences before sleeping with my wife and ruining my life. David tried to argue that I was being unfair, that Karen was just as much to blame, and I agreed, but I had already divorced her. She was now his responsibility. He raised his voice, pleading, but I cut him off. I told him that he was no longer the favored son, no longer the golden child. He was now the black sheep of the family, the brother who had slept with his own brother's wife and destroyed everything. Hearing that seemed to break him. He started crying, telling me that everyone had turned their backs on him, even our grandparents and cousins. He was completely alone. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. I had never heard David cry, not since we were kids. But that sympathy quickly faded. His tears were not my concern anymore. I told him that we were done and hung up the phone. Since then, I've replayed the conversation in my head. Despite everything, I still feel conflicted. Should I talk to our parents about him? Should I try to help him out of this mess? Or is it time for me to fully move on and cut ties with him completely? That was the conclusion of the video. To all my viewers, thank you for watching and for all the support. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more real-life stories.